After years of public controversy, family division, accusations, internet outrage, and one of the most talked about church scandals online,
what if the biggest crisis in one of Christian television's most powerful families had nothing to do with what happened on camera? For years, the Lamb family built an empire around faith, family, and forgiveness. But behind the scenes, a very different reality was unfolding. Then the founder died, and shocking allegations emerged. Now, Rodney Howard is speaking out about Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss, raising new questions about what really happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Rodney Howard-Browne and the warning no one wanted to hear. If there was one thing Rodney Howard-Browne had never been known for, it was keeping his mouth shut when he believed something was spiritually wrong. Born in South Africa, Rodney rose to international attention during the 1990s as one of the most intense and unpredictable figures in the global charismatic movement. His meetings were not safe or predictable. They were marked by raw spiritual intensity, unusual manifestations, emotional outbursts, and a complete refusal to soften hard truths for the sake of comfort, reputation, or institutional peace. He became the kind of preacher people either embraced completely or kept at a careful distance. Supporters saw him as a revivalist who carried genuine fire, someone willing to challenge religious politics and confront what he believed had become compromised. Critics saw him as extreme, disruptive, and sometimes reckless. But almost no one who watched him closely ever accused him of being careful with his words when he believed something was spiritually wrong. That reputation matters here because Rodney's connection to the Daystar story was never simply about appearing on television or being another familiar face in Christian broadcasting. Rodney was never a salaried on-air personality at Daystar. He did not sit in their boardrooms, work for the network, or collect a paycheck from it. His connection was rooted elsewhere, in the overlapping world of charismatic ministry, conference platforms, friendships, preaching relationships, and influential Christian leaders who often crossed paths behind the scenes. And that distinction is important, because being outside an organization does not necessarily mean being outside its circle. Rodney moved through the same ministry networks that connected many of the people at the center of Christian television. He had relationships and access that most ordinary viewers would never have. He was close enough to hear things, observe things, and form opinions long before those matters became public conversation. According to the accounts that later surfaced, that proximity eventually became a burden he could not simply set down. When Rodney began speaking about Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss, he was not presenting himself as a random outsider who had suddenly discovered a controversy online. He claimed he had been carrying concerns for a long time, and that changes the weight of what he was saying. Because by the time he spoke publicly, this was no longer just about theology, personality, or ministry style. It was about what Rodney believed he had witnessed. What he believed was happening behind the scenes, and whether staying silent had become more uncomfortable than speaking out. For a man whose entire public identity had been built around saying what he believed needed to be said, silence was never going to be the easy option. The empire he watched from the edges. Before any of the public scandals ever broke, Daystar television network looked nearly untouchable. Marcus and Joni Lamb had built something extraordinary from almost nothing. Two young evangelists with more faith than financial resources had taken a small station in Alabama and transformed it into a global Christian broadcasting platform that eventually reached more than 100 million households. What started as a modest ministry had grown into an institution with enormous influence, a recognizable name, and a place at the center of Christian television. To the watching world, the Lambs were the living picture of unity, sustained anointing, and remarkable success. Marcus was the visionary driver, the public engine of the network, while Joni became the steady, warm, relational presence beside him. Together, they created an image that went far beyond television. They represented a ministry family that appeared to have survived every challenge thrown at them. Their marriage, their ministry, their family, and their faith were constantly presented as parts of the same testimony, and millions of viewers believed in that testimony. Rodney Howard-Browne observed that rise from the broader charismatic world. He was not sitting inside Daystar's daily operations, and he was not involved in its financial decisions, but he was close enough to understand the culture surrounding the network, the influence it carried, and the carefully maintained public image that came with that influence. He understood something that outsiders often miss about major ministries. Reputation is not merely reputation, it is currency. For an organization like Daystar, trust was everything. Millions of ordinary believers were not simply turning on their televisions to watch another program. They were inviting ministry leaders into their homes. They were listening to them pray, teach, counsel, and speak about their own families. Over time, that familiarity created a powerful sense of personal connection. Daystar's success depended in part on that trust, and Rodney understood how much was at stake when that trust was threatened. Then, on November 30, 2021, Marcus Lamb died after complications related to COVID-19. The announcement sent shockwaves through Daystar and the wider Christian media world. Marcus had not simply been the network's founder and public face. He had been one half of the partnership that had defined Daystar for decades. Suddenly, Joni was standing alone. The public watched as she stepped forward, as the grieving widow, composed but visibly heartbroken, determined to carry the ministry and the vision forward, without the man who had built it beside her. Tributes poured in, flowers arrived, prayers came from churches, ministers, viewers, and Christian leaders around the world. On television, Joni spoke about Marcus's life, his faith, and the future he had helped build. She presented herself as a woman determined to keep moving despite the enormous loss. From the outside, the story seemed almost painfully simple. A beloved Christian broadcaster had died. His wife was grieving. His ministry had been left in her hands, and now she had to find the strength to continue. But according to what Rodney later claimed, the transition was not nearly as straightforward as it appeared on television. Behind the polished broadcasts and public expressions of faith, he believed something far more troubling was already beginning to move beneath the surface. And if his account was accurate, Marcus's death did not create the problems that followed. It exposed them. The relationship that made Rodney speak. Within months of Marcus's death, a new relationship began to form between Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss. Weiss was already a familiar face to Daystar viewers, a licensed psychologist, the author of more than 40 books, and a frequent guest who specialized in sex addiction, intimacy disorders, and the recovery of broken marriages. To many in the audience, he represented professional insight, healing, and a compassionate understanding of human brokenness. The relationship moved with noticeable speed. By March 2023, an engagement was announced live on air. By June of the same year, they were married. Almost overnight, Doug Weiss was no longer simply a guest. He was co-hosting the flagship program, appearing at events beside Joni and occupying a highly visible public place that had once belonged exclusively to Marcus Lamb. To large segments of the viewing audience, the story looked redemptive and hopeful. A widow finding new love after devastating loss. A counselor stepping into a supportive role. A ministry continuing forward with fresh strength. To Rodney Howard-Browne, according to the specific claims that later became public, the story looked very different. He allegedly began telling people close to the situation that the contact between Joni and Doug had started earlier than the official public timeline suggested. He used strong, direct language that Joni would later call a complete and deeply damaging lie. In recorded conversations that eventually leaked into public view, She insisted repeatedly that the relationship had remained pure until marriage, and that Rodney had harmed the reputation of a godly man by speaking carelessly to others instead of bringing any concern directly to her first. But the words had already been spoken in private rooms and private conversations, and once those words were out, they began to travel through the same relational networks that had once helped protect the polished image. According to multiple consistent accounts from people who spoke directly with him during that season, Rodney Howard-Browne did not simply hold a theological or personal disagreement about the speed or the circumstances of the remarriage. He claimed he was visited by nightmares of unusual intensity and clarity. 3 consecutive nights he woke up soaked in sweat, heart pounding violently, unable to calm himself or return to sleep. He described seeing Daystar in a state of destruction. He described a heavy darkness surrounding Joni. The final images, he said, were so oppressive and disturbing that he could barely force himself to put them into spoken words, even with people he trusted. He claimed he tried to warn. He tried to reach the specific people who needed to hear the concern while there was still time to change course. Those who listened to him in that period describe a man who felt he had been shown something he did not ask for, did not want, and yet could not ignore. The dreams were never presented as a platform-building opportunity or a chance to gain attention. They were described as a genuine burden, an unwanted spiritual weight that left him shaken, physically affected, and internally compelled to speak. He was not a late-arriving commentator reacting to public scandal after the damage was already visible. He claimed he had been carrying the warning in the night long before the rest of the world realized anything was wrong. That claimed sequence, private burden first, public consequences much later, is what continues to give his involvement its particular and lasting gravity. The moment the private conflict exploded. While Rodney was allegedly sounding alarms in private conversations and carrying the weight of those dreams, the Lamb family itself was fracturing in ways that would eventually become impossible to hide from the public. Jonathan Lamb had grown up quite literally on camera. Many people, both inside and outside the ministry, assumed he was being gradually prepared to one day lead the network his father had founded and built. Instead, in the months and years after Marcus's death, he found himself increasingly sidelined. Important decisions were made without his input. His regular on-air presence diminished until fans began publicly asking where he had gone. The silence from the network only deepened the questions. When Jonathan and his wife Susie eventually refused to publicly celebrate or affirm the new marriage in the way that was being requested, the tension that had been building for a long time in private finally detonated. What began as a disagreement over a relationship rapidly escalated into a full and bitter rupture. Susie lost her position at the network. Her parents, who also worked at Daystar, lost their positions as well. Jonathan held on longer than the others but was eventually terminated. The network officially cited performance deficiencies after a lengthy review process. Jonathan and Susie described something very different: a sustained pattern of exclusion, pressure, spiritual control, and intimidation. They later went public with a series of serious allegations that included claims of spiritual abuse and far more grave accusations involving the handling of a young child's safety. Daystar firmly and repeatedly denied the claims, framing the entire conflict as a power struggle driven by Jonathan's disappointment over not being named the successor. As the accusations and counter-accusations flew, programmers began pulling their shows from the network. Viewer trust began to erode in visible and measurable ways. For those who had already heard Rodney's earlier private concerns and the reports of his nightmares, the public collapse felt like a painful and sobering confirmation. For others, it felt like the destructive and unnecessary result of division, accusation, and disloyalty. Either way, the man who claimed he had seen darkness approaching in the night was no longer easy to dismiss as an irrelevant outsider. The price Rodney paid for speaking out. Rodney Howard-Browne never appeared to turn the growing controversy into a personal media campaign. He did not sit for endless interviews, flood the internet with commentary, or build an ongoing content series around the pain surrounding the Lamb family. His reported role remained that of the uncomfortable early witness, the man who claimed he tried to raise concerns in private rooms before they ever became public conversations. He spoke about dreams that left him physically shaken, warnings he believed he could not simply dismiss, and conversations that, according to his account, weighed heavily on him long before the wider controversy exploded. And that is what makes his involvement so difficult to ignore. Rodney was not presenting himself as someone who had discovered the story after everyone else had already formed an opinion. He claimed he had been concerned while the public image was still intact, while Daystar remained one of the most recognizable names in Christian broadcasting, and while challenging the people at its center could come with serious relational consequences. That relative restraint is part of what gives his involvement lasting weight. In an environment where many leaders either stayed completely silent or offered public words of blessing, covering, and support, Rodney's willingness to express deep concern, first quietly and at personal relational cost, then in ways that could no longer be contained, set him apart. But speaking up did not come without consequences. Joni's own recorded responses revealed just how sharply his words landed. She accused Rodney of running his mouth, damaging the reputations of good people, and choosing to speak to her children and others instead of bringing his concerns directly to her in what she considered the proper way. Those accusations transformed what had once been a private disagreement into something far more painful. The issue was no longer simply what Rodney believed. It was who he had spoken to, why he had spoken, and whether he had crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. The relational rupture between them became another deep fracture in an already breaking landscape. And this is where Rodney's involvement raises a much bigger question. The issue is not simply whether every specific claim he made will ultimately be proven accurate in a court of law or formal investigation. The more uncomfortable question is what happens when someone inside the same spiritual world claims to see danger approaching and decides that remaining silent carries a greater cost than speaking. Because sometimes the hardest thing about telling the truth is not finding the courage to say it. The warning that still haunts the story. In May 2026, after a period of serious and worsening health complications that began with a significant back injury, Joni Lamb passed away at the age of 65. Even in death, the family division remained painfully unresolved. Jonathan and Susie publicly stated that they had not been properly informed how critical the medical situation had become and were not given the opportunity to say goodbye in the way they believed they should have been allowed. The estrangement that had defined the final years of Joni's life followed the family all the way to the funeral and beyond. And through every single stage of the public collapse, the claims Rodney Howard-Browne had made years earlier continued to echo with uncomfortable persistence. The alleged early timeline of the relationship, the private warnings he claimed to have delivered while the public image was still fully intact, the nightmares he described as so intense and relentless that they left him physically affected and emotionally burdened. Whether every detail is ultimately proven, disproven, or left forever in the unresolved tension of competing accounts and denials, one reality remains difficult to push aside. A man who claimed he saw the darkness coming refused to pretend the light was still pure and unbroken. That refusal is the real reason his name belongs at the absolute center of this story. Not because he was the loudest or most constant voice during the later public war of accusations, but because he claims he was one of the earliest to feel the full weight of the approaching storm, while most others were still publicly praising the calm. The allegations that shattered the perfect image. The polished and carefully maintained image of Daystar as a bright beacon of hope, healing, and unbroken faith did not survive the collision of profound grief, institutional power, rapid remarriage, deep family rupture, and a series of unresolved and deeply serious allegations. Rodney Howard-Browne's decision to speak, first through dreams he said he could not shake off in the night, then in private conversations that carried real relational cost, and finally in ways that reached far beyond those original rooms, forced a question that many people never wanted to confront in the light. How much of what millions of sincere believers watched on screen week after week was genuine, and how much was a carefully protected performance designed to preserve an image? The cameras are still rolling. The network continues its daily programming. But the trust that once felt almost unshakable has been permanently and irreversibly altered by the man who claimed he saw the cracks forming in the night and chose, at real personal cost, not to stay silent about them. Daystar television network survived controversy for decades, but losing both founders while the family stayed divided may be the biggest test yet. Money, marriage, loyalty, and grief all collided inside one of the largest ministries in the country. What part of this story surprised me the most? The financial questions or the family fallout? Type an answer below, hit like, and subscribe for more fully researched stories every single week.